On the 4th of July, 1828, two things broke ground in the state of Maryland, and the whole future of American transportation was riding on which one won. In Washington, the President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, lifted a ceremonial spade to turn the first earth of a great canal, the Chesapeake and Ohio, that was meant to carry the commerce of the young nation up the Potomac Valley and over the mountains all the way to the Ohio River in the west. And the story that has always been told is that when the president pushed his spade into the ground, it struck a tree root and stopped dead, and he had to try again, and some people in the crowd took it as a bad omen. That same day, in Baltimore, an old man named Charles Carroll, the last living man who had signed the Declaration of Independence, laid the first stone of a very different thing: the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. A canal and a railroad, born on the same day, aimed at the same prize, the riches of the West, up the same narrow river valley. It was a race. And here is the thing you need to know before we go a single step further. The canal lost. But before it lost, thousands of men, most of them Irish immigrants fresh off the boat, dug that canal 184 miles by hand, with picks and shovels and black powder and wheelbarrows, cutting it foot by foot up the Potomac. They drove a tunnel more than half a mile long straight through a mountain and lined it with 6 million bricks. And they paid for it in a way the history books mostly skip over. They died of cholera in the mud by the score. And in one terrible winter, they went to war with each other, Irishmen against Irishmen, and killed their own, until the President of the United States sent federal troops to a canal ditch to stop them. This is the story of the C&O Canal, the great water highway that was obsolete almost before it was finished, and of the forgotten army of immigrants who dug it anyway, for $8 a month, into a mountain, for a dream the railroad had already killed. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back. Because this is a story about losing, and about the men who gave everything to build something that was beaten before they finished, and who deserve to be remembered even though the thing they built did not win. To understand why anyone poured a fortune and thousands of lives into this canal, you have to understand the moment it was born into. Just 3 years earlier, in 1825, New York had opened the Erie Canal, and the Erie Canal had been a staggering, world-changing success. A ribbon of water that connected the Atlantic to the Great Lakes and made New York City the commercial capital of the continent almost overnight. Every other city on the East Coast looked at that and panicked. If New York had a water highway to the west and they did not, they would be left behind forever. And so Washington and the cities of the Chesapeake reached for their own answer: a canal that would run up the Potomac River, through the mountains, and down to the Ohio River, tapping the whole interior of the country and pulling its trade back east to the Chesapeake Bay. On paper, it was magnificent. A continuous artificial river, hundreds of miles long, climbing over the Appalachian Mountains by a staircase of locks, carrying boats heavy with the coal and grain and timber of the West. It was one of the boldest engineering dreams in the young country's history. It is hard, from here, to feel how total that panic was, so let me make the Erie Canal real for a second. Before 1825, moving a ton of goods from the East Coast over the mountains to the interior was so slow and so expensive that it was barely worth doing. The Erie Canal, more than 350 miles of hand-dug ditch across New York State, changed that overnight. It cut the cost of moving freight between the Great Lakes and New York City by something close to 90%, and it turned a busy port into the greatest commercial city in the hemisphere within a generation. Every merchant and politician on the East Coast understood exactly what they were seeing. A canal to the west was not a convenience. It was the difference between a city that would dominate the next century and a city that would be left behind. Baltimore and Washington, and the whole Chesapeake region, looked at New York's triumph with something close to terror, because geography seemed to have handed the prize to New York. And they cast around for their own route west, and the one that made sense followed the Potomac, the river that ran right up into the mountains from the Chesapeake, pointing like an arrow toward the Ohio country beyond. If they could turn the Potomac Valley into a canal and push it over the divide to the Ohio River, they could pull the trade of the whole interior back to the Chesapeake and answer New York blow for blow. That was the dream that put a ceremonial spade in a president's hands on the 4th of July, 1828. It was a good dream. It was, in its way, a magnificent one. It was simply about to be overtaken by a better machine. But there was a serpent in the garden, and it had been born on the very same day: the railroad. In 1828, the railroad was brand new and unproven, a strange and clanking novelty, and almost everyone assumed the canal was the safe, serious bet, and the railroad was the gamble. They had it exactly backwards, and the two of them collided almost immediately because they both needed the same thing: a narrow strip of level ground along the north bank of the Potomac in a tight gorge where there was really only room for one of them. At a place called Point of Rocks, the canal company and the railroad company ran straight into each other and went to court, and they fought a legal battle over that narrow corridor for 4 years. 4 years of delay. While the lawyers argued over who had the right to the ground, the canal eventually won the lawsuit. But the 4 years it lost fighting were 4 years the railroad used to get ahead, and in a race, time is everything. And you have to appreciate how completely everyone misjudged the two rivals at the start, because it is one of the great lessons of the whole affair. In 1828, a canal was proven, respectable, understood. Canals had built empires going back to antiquity, and the Erie had just shown they could do it in America. A railroad, on the other hand, was a curiosity. A set of iron rails with primitive engines that broke down and threw sparks and frightened the horses. Unproven over any real distance, backed by men many considered dreamers or fools. If you had asked almost anyone on that groundbreaking day which of the two would carry the commerce of the West, they would have said the canal without hesitation. The canal was the sure thing. The railroad was the gamble, and they were wrong, catastrophically wrong, and the fight at Point of Rocks is where the cost of that misjudgment first became visible. Where the Potomac squeezes through a gap in the hills, there was room for a canal or a railroad along the bank, but not comfortably for both, and both companies claimed the ground. So, they did what Americans do. They sued, and the lawsuit dragged on for 4 years while both projects stalled at the choke point and the lawyers grew rich. The canal company won the legal right to the disputed ground in the end. But those 4 years were the most expensive victory imaginable, because the railroad, free to build in other directions and faster by its very nature, used the time the lawsuit stole to pull decisively ahead. The canal won the courtroom and lost the race, and it lost it, in part, right there at Point of Rocks, standing still for 4 years while its rival learned to run. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. Now, let me introduce you to the men who actually dug it, because a canal is not built by presidents with ceremonial spades or by lawyers at Point of Rocks. It is dug by hand, out of the ground, by laborers, and the laborers who dug the C&O were overwhelmingly Irish, with a substantial number of Germans and some native-born Americans mixed in. They came as the digging demanded them, starting around 1829. Many of them recruited straight off the immigrant ships, sometimes under labor contracts that bound them to the work. And the terms tell you exactly what kind of life it was. A common laborer on the canal earned somewhere between $8 and $12 a month, with a skilled mason earning around $20. In exchange for that, and for the brutal labor of digging a canal by hand, the company promised them meat 3 times a day, vegetables, and, in the words of the actual arrangement, a reasonable allowance of whiskey. That whiskey ration was standard on these projects, given out through the day to men doing killing physical labor, and it is part of the texture of the whole enterprise. Thousands of men swinging picks and setting black powder in the heat, fueled on meat and whiskey, living in rough shanty camps strung along the line of the cut. Those camps are worth picturing because they were the whole world of the men who built this. A canal under construction was a moving town, or rather a long chain of moving towns. Rough clusters of shanties thrown up along the line wherever the digging had reached, housing the laborers and often their wives and children too. They were crowded, they were filthy, and they had almost nothing in the way of sanitation because they were temporary by design, meant to be abandoned and rebuilt further up the line as the cut advanced. The men worked from first light to dark, 6 days a week, moving earth with the simplest tools imaginable: the pick to break the ground, the shovel to lift it, the wheelbarrow and the horse-drawn cart to haul it away, and black powder to blast the rock the pick could not touch. The whiskey ration ran through the whole day, a swallow here and a swallow there, so common on these works that it was written right into the terms of employment, and it did what you would expect. easing the misery of the labor and feeding the tempers that would eventually explode. There was no safety of any kind. A misfired charge, a collapsing bank, a runaway cart, an infected cut, any of it could kill or cripple a man, and there was no compensation and no protection if it did. You dug until you could not, and if you were hurt or sick, you were simply replaced, because there was always another ship full of desperate men arriving in Baltimore or New York, ready to take your $8 a month and your place in the mud, and they were not one people. They were Irish, but Ireland is a place of deep local loyalties, and the men came from different parts of it, and those divisions came across the ocean with them. On the canal, the two largest groups were men from County Cork and men from County Longford, and the friction between them was so constant and so dangerous that the company found it had to keep them in separate work crews on separate stretches of the line just to prevent them from fighting. Hold on to that, because it is going to boil over into something terrible, and it is one of the darkest and most human parts of this whole story. But before the men could turn on each other, something else came for them first, something that did not care what county they were from. In the late summer of 1832, cholera came to the canal. It swept up the Potomac Valley and into the crowded, filthy, unsanitary shanty camps like fire through dry grass. Cholera in those camps was a death sentence for many. Striking a healthy man in the morning and killing him by nightfall spread through the fouled water the men drank without knowing it was killing them. So many workers died, and so many of the survivors threw down their tools and fled in terror that the work on the entire canal very nearly stopped for months. The men who died of it were buried quickly and roughly, often in unmarked graves right along the line of the canal they were digging, and to this day their bones lie somewhere under the towpath, nameless, uncounted with any real accuracy. The clean, quiet green canal park that people stroll along today runs directly over the graves of Irishmen who came across an ocean to dig it and died of cholera in the mud before they could finish. I want to stay with that cholera a moment because the scale of it in those camps is hard to grasp. Cholera was one of the great terrors of the 19th century, a disease that could take a strong man from perfect health to death in a single day, killing by a violent, dehydrating sickness that emptied the body of fluid. No one understood, yet, that it spread through water contaminated with human waste, which was exactly the condition that prevailed in a crowded canal camp with no sanitation, where the men drank from the same ground they fouled. So when cholera reached the line in the late summer of 1832, it did not just sicken a few, it scythed through the camps. Men who had been digging in the morning were dead by night. The healthy fled in panic, scattering into the countryside to escape it, and for a time the great project simply halted, its workforce dead or dispersed, its camps turned into places of horror. The company did what it could, which was not much, and the dead were buried fast and shallow and namelessly, wherever there was ground, along the line of the unfinished canal. There was no time and no thought for records, for headstones, for telling some family back in Ireland what had become of their son. The men went into the ground where they fell. And when the panic finally passed and new workers were found, the canal was dug right on past and over those graves, so that the finished towpath runs today over the unmarked resting places of the men the cholera took, an untold number of them, lost even to a proper count. Before I go on, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click, come back. Because now I have to tell you about the winter the diggers went to war, and it is not an easy thing to tell. By the middle of the 1830s, the tensions in the camps, the crowding, the hard conditions, the drink, the fear over wages and work, and above all, the old county rivalries between the Cork men and the Longford men had wound tight as a spring. And in January of 1834, it snapped. What happened was not a brawl. It was closer to a battle. A force of some 700 men from the Longford faction, armed with guns and clubs, marched on a camp of about 300 Cork men and fell on them. They routed them, they burned down the shanties the Cork men lived in, and they killed. As many as 10 men died in that violence, and among the dead was a group of 5 men who were reportedly found shot through the head. Irish immigrants, who had crossed the ocean together fleeing the same poverty, who were doing the same brutal work side by side, slaughtering each other in the frozen mud over the ancient divisions of the country they had left behind. It was so bad so completely beyond the ability of the local authorities to control that it reached all the way to the President of the United States. And Andrew Jackson, the president who styled himself the champion of the common man, sent federal troops, soldiers of the United States Army, to a canal construction site to put down the violence and restore order. It is remembered as the first time in American history that federal troops were sent to intervene in a labor dispute. The men who were digging America's Great Canal had become, for a moment, a war that the Army had to be called out to stop. I do not tell you that to sensationalize it, but because it is real, and it is human, and it is part of the honest truth of who built this country and at what cost. It is easy to romanticize immigrant labor, to make of these men a single noble mass of suffering builders. And they were builders, and they did suffer. But they were also people from particular places, carrying particular loyalties and hatreds, and the pressure of the camps turned some of those hatreds lethal. The rivalry between the men of Cork and the men of Longford was not about the canal at all. It was an old country feud, transplanted whole across an ocean, and it fed on the misery and the crowding and the whiskey and the competition for work until it became something murderous. Understand that these were desperate men in a desperate situation, worked to exhaustion, drinking hard, living in squalor, afraid for their wages and their futures, and packed together with men they had been taught since childhood to despise. That is a formula for violence in any time and place. And in the frozen January of 1834, it produced a killing in the mud of the Potomac Valley. And the response is what makes it a landmark. When the state could not control it, the matter went up the chain until it reached President Andrew Jackson himself, and Jackson ordered federal troops to the canal. Soldiers of the United States Army, marching to a construction site to impose order on the men digging a ditch. Historians mark it as the first time the federal government sent troops to intervene in an American labor dispute, a grim precedent that would be repeated in very different circumstances for the rest of the century, whenever the conflicts of labor grew too large for local authority to hold. So the canal carries this dark distinction buried in its history. It is not only a monument to what immigrant hands could build, it is also the site of one of the first times the young republic turned its army on the working men within its own borders. Both of those things happened on the same muddy line along the Potomac, and both are true, and the men who died in that January violence are as much a part of this canal's story as the 6 million bricks in its tunnel. They are just harder to look at. And they too were buried without ceremony and without names. Irishmen killed by Irishmen. In the frozen ground beside the ditch, they had all crossed an ocean to dig. And I keep asking myself what happened to the ones left behind, because the record does not tell me, and the not telling is the point. When a man died on that canal, of cholera or a blast or a bullet in the January dark, he very often did not die alone in the world. Many of these laborers had brought wives and children with them into the camps or had families waiting back in Ireland on the wages he sent home. When he went into an unmarked grave beside the ditch, what became of them? A widow in a shanty camp on the Potomac frontier, with children and no husband and no wage and no way home, is one of the truly invisible figures of this whole history, and there were surely many of them. The company's ledgers, where they survive, count the labor and the cost. They do not, as a rule, count the grief. They do not record the woman who lost her husband to the tunnel, or the children who drove the mules a little harder because their father was in the ground, or the family in County Cork who simply stopped receiving letters and never learned why. All of that human aftermath, the real and lasting cost of building this thing, happened in the dark spaces the records do not reach. We know the canal cost $11 million. We will never know what it cost in the other currency, the one paid by the people who loved the men who died digging it. That ledger was never kept at all. One quick note, I turned the full story into a book, everything the records gave me. If you want it, the link is in the description. And through all of it, the cholera and the killing and the lawsuits and the delays, the canal itself slowly took shape, and it is worth understanding what a piece of work it actually was. When it was finally finished, the C&O Canal ran 184.5 miles from Georgetown, right beside Washington, all the way up the Potomac to the city of Cumberland, Maryland. Over that distance, the land rises about 605 feet, and a canal cannot climb a hill. So to lift the boats up that height, the builders constructed a staircase of 74 lift locks, each one a chamber with gates at both ends that could be filled or emptied to raise or lower a canal boat from one level to the next. A technology as old as it was ingenious, worked entirely by hand, gate by gate, boat by boat. They built 11 great stone aqueducts to carry the canal itself across the rivers that fed into the Potomac, water bridges, channels of water crossing over channels of water. They built dams and culverts and lockhouses. The whole thing was a continuous hand-built artificial river climbing the side of a mountain range, and it cost in the end more than $11 million, an astronomical sum for the era, far more than anyone had planned. Let me make those locks and aqueducts real, because they are the ingenious heart of how a canal climbs a mountain, and they were all worked by hand. A canal boat cannot go uphill. Water lies flat. So, to raise a boat from a lower stretch of canal to a higher one, the builders used a lift lock, and the principle is beautifully simple. The lock is a stone chamber, just bigger than a boat, with a heavy wooden gate at each end. A boat going upstream enters the chamber from the lower level, and the lower gate is closed behind it. Then water is let in from the upper level through valves, and the water in the chamber rises, and the boat rises with it, floating upward inside the stone box until it is level with the upper stretch of canal. Then the upper gate swings open, and the boat sails out, higher than it entered, lifted by nothing but water and gravity and the muscle of a lockkeeper cranking the gates and valves by hand. 74 times, up the length of the canal, a boat repeated that patient ceremony to climb the 600 feet from Georgetown to Cumberland. And where the canal had to cross a river running down into the Potomac, the builders raised a stone aqueduct, a bridge that carried the canal, water and boats and all, right over the river below, 11 of them along the line, great works of cut stone that still stand. Along the whole 184 miles ran the towpath, because the boats had no engines. They were pulled by mules, teams of them walking the towpath, leaning into their harness to drag the loaded boats along at a walking pace, driven often by boys, the children of the boat families who lived aboard. It was a slow, quiet, human, and animal way of moving freight, and it was already, even as it opened, being made obsolete by the shriek and the speed of the locomotive on the far bank of the river. It is worth seeing the finished waterway itself too, plainly because for all that it lost the race, it was a real and impressive thing. The canal was a prism of water, perhaps 60 feet wide at the surface and 6 feet deep, cut and banked and lined for 184 continuous miles, a made river holding steady up the side of the land. The boats that used it were long and narrow, built to just fit the locks, and when the whole system opened all the way to Cumberland in 1850, a boat could be floated the entire distance from the mountains to tidewater at Georgetown, stepping down through all 74 locks, and gliding over all 11 aqueducts, and passing through the black half-mile of the Paw Paw Tunnel, carried the whole way by the towpath mules and the patient opening and closing of gates. In a world without the railroad, it would have been one of the wonders of the country, a highway of water that turned the barrier of the mountains into a gentle downhill glide. It was late, and it was beaten, and it never reached the Ohio. But the stretch it did complete was, on its own terms, a masterpiece of hand engineering. 184 miles of water made to behave, and it is worth pausing to admire it as the men who dug it never quite got to, because for them it was always only the next 100 feet of mud. And then there was the mountain that would not move, and the tunnel they drove through it, which is the single most extraordinary and most terrible piece of the entire canal. Up near the far end of the line, the Potomac makes an enormous, twisting loop around a mountain ridge, a great horseshoe bend that would have added miles to the canal and cost a fortune in extra locks to follow. So the engineers made a fateful decision. They would not go around the mountain, they would go through it. They would drive a tunnel, straight through the ridge, big enough to carry the canal and a towpath, and let the boats pass through the mountain in the dark. The Paw Paw Tunnel, as it came to be called, was to be 3,118 feet long, well over half a mile of tunnel bored through solid rock. They estimated it would take about 2 years and cost around $33,000. It took nearly 12 years, and it cost over $600,000, and it very nearly bankrupted the whole canal. The work in that tunnel is almost unimaginable. As many as 400 men, mostly Irish, drove that bore through the mountain by hand, in a rhythm of pick-and-shovel labor punctuated by black powder blasts, working in the dark and the choking smoke and the constant danger of falling rock. To speed the work, they sank vertical shafts down from the top of the ridge to the level of the tunnel, so they could dig outward in multiple directions at once from the bottom of each shaft, and they hauled the broken rock up out of those shafts, more than 200,000 cubic yards of stone and earth removed from inside the mountain by hand and by windlass. And because the rock could not be trusted to hold on its own, they lined the entire tunnel, its walls and its great arched ceiling, with brick, laid 7, 9, 11 courses thick in places. They built a kiln right there on site just to make the bricks, and they used, by the count, something like 6 million of them to line that single tunnel. 6 million bricks, made and laid by hand, to sheath half a mile of hole through a mountain. The men working in there breathed powder smoke and rock dust in the dark for years, and the tunnel, more than anything else, was what turned the canal from a bold project into a financial catastrophe, swallowing money and time while the railroad raced on. The Paw Paw Tunnel earned every bit of its terrible reputation, and the story of building it is the story of a project that spiraled almost completely out of control. It had been let to a contractor on the confident estimate of about 2 years and $30,000, and almost nothing about that estimate survived contact with the mountain. The rock was harder and more treacherous than expected. The work went slower than anyone imagined. The contractor ran into financial trouble, as contractors on that tunnel did repeatedly, and the labor troubles that plagued the whole canal were concentrated there among the hundreds of men packed into that one desperate bore. Progress was measured not in feet per day, but sometimes in inches, as men drilled their holes by hand into the rock face, packed them with black powder, fired them, cleared the shattered stone, and advanced the face a little further into the dark. Over and over, year after year. To attack the rock from more than just the two ends, they sank vertical shafts down through the top of the ridge to the tunnel line, so crews could work outward from the bottom of each shaft in both directions, multiplying the number of rock faces being cut at once, and hauling the broken stone up and out through the shafts, more than 200,000 cubic yards of it in the end. And behind the diggers came the bricklayers, sheathing the raw bore in those millions of bricks to keep the mountain from falling in on the canal, firing the bricks in a kiln built right at the site because it was easier to make them there than to haul them in. Years passed like this. The tunnel that was supposed to take 2 years took closer to 12. The cost that was supposed to be $30,000 ran past $600,000. It became a kind of open wound in the canal's finances, bleeding money and time, and it is a large part of why the canal reached Cumberland so late and so broke. And yet they finished it. Half a mile of tunnel, driven straight through a mountain, dug and blasted and bricked entirely by hand, is still there and still sound, nearly 2 centuries later. It nearly killed the canal to build, and it is now the single most unforgettable thing on the whole route. Because the railroad did not wait. While the canal company fought its lawsuits and buried its cholera dead and called out the army and inched its way into the Paw Paw Mountain, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was doing the one thing the canal could not do. It was moving fast. A railroad did not need to climb by a staircase of locks or bore through mountains to keep a channel of water level. It could follow grades and curves the canal never could, and it could be built more quickly and run faster once it was built. In 1842, the B&O Railroad reached Cumberland, Maryland. The canal did not reach Cumberland until 1850, a full 8 years later. Think about what that means. The entire purpose of the canal was to be the great highway to the west, and by the time it finally clawed its way to Cumberland, the railroad had already been there for 8 years, already carrying the freight the canal had been built to carry. The race was over, and the canal had lost it, and everyone knew it. The grand dream of pushing on from Cumberland over the mountains to the Ohio River was quietly abandoned as hopeless and unaffordable. The canal that was named for the Chesapeake and the Ohio never reached the Ohio at all. It stopped at Cumberland, less than halfway to the river in its own name, beaten by the rival that had been born on the very same day. There is a lesson in that defeat that goes well beyond canals and railroads, and I think it is part of why the story stays with people. The canal did nothing wrong, exactly. It was superbly engineered. It was built by the hardest kind of labor with real skill. Its locks worked, its aqueducts held, its tunnel was a marvel. By every measure of craft, it was a triumph. And it lost anyway, completely, because the world changed underneath it while it was being built. The thing that beat it was not a better canal. It was a different kind of thing altogether, a technology that made the entire premise of the canal obsolete, and no amount of excellence in canal building could answer it. The men who conceived the C&O had bet, reasonably, on the proven technology of their moment, and the ground shifted under that bet before they could collect on it. It is one of the clearest examples in American history of doing everything right and still being overtaken, of pouring genius and labor and fortune and life into a masterpiece that the future simply drove around. And the people who paid the highest price for that miscalculation were not the investors who lost money or the planners who lost face. They were the Irish in the tunnel, who paid in sweat and disease, and, some of them, in blood and in their very lives, to finish a thing that was already defeated before their work was done. And here's the thing that I find almost unbearably poignant about it. The men were still digging. All through those years, when the outcome was already obvious, when everyone could see the railroad had won, the Irish laborers were still down in the Pawpaw Tunnel, in the dark, still laying brick, still setting powder, still dying, to finish a canal to a city the railroad had already reached. They finished the race years after it was lost. They completed, with enormous suffering, a magnificent thing that the world had already moved past. Whatever they were told, whatever they understood of the larger picture, the work in front of them was the same. Dig the tunnel, lay the brick, cut the ditch, and they did it to the end. And the thing they built opened in 1850 into a world that no longer needed it the way it once would have. The canal did not die immediately, and it deserves that much credit. For about 75 years, from 1850 until the 1920s, the C&O Canal did real work, mostly hauling coal down from the mountains of western Maryland to Washington, mule teams plodding along the towpath, pulling the loaded boats, whole families living aboard those boats and working the locks, a slower, older way of moving freight, surviving in the shadow of the railroads for 3 generations. That long, stubborn afterlife is its own quiet story, and I have a soft spot for it. For 3/4 of a century after it opened, the canal was a living thing, not a monument, but a working highway, mostly for coal. Boats, 100 feet long, loaded with coal from the western Maryland mines, rode the canal down to Georgetown behind their mule teams, and whole families lived aboard those boats the year round, the parents working the boat and the locks, the children driving the mules along the towpath, a distinct and now vanished way of American life, lived at the walking pace of a mule. It was slower than the railroad, always, and it survived not by beating the railroad, but by finding the work the railroad did not want, the patient, heavy, unglamorous hauling of coal, for as long as that made any economic sense at all. Floods battered it again and again, and each time it cost more to repair than it earned, and finally, in the 1920s, after one last devastating flood, the canal closed for good. The water went still, the boats rotted, the towpath grew over. And for a while it seemed the whole thing would simply be erased, and in the 1950s a plan took shape to pave the entire route and turn it into a scenic highway, which would have buried the canal forever under asphalt. What saved it was one man's love of the place, a justice of the Supreme Court named William O. Dodd. Douglas, who walked the towpath for pleasure, publicly challenged the highway's backers to walk the full 184 miles with him and see what they proposed to destroy. It was a brilliant, stubborn gesture, and it worked. Enough influential people made that walk and were moved enough by the beauty and the history of what they saw that the highway plan died and the canal was preserved as a national historical park. So the thing the Irish dug, the masterpiece that lost its race, was rescued from a second death by a judge on a hike, and it survives today, all 184 miles of it, as one of the most beloved long walks in America. But it never became what it was meant to become. It never crossed the mountains. It never reached the Ohio, and in the end, floods and the relentless competition of the railroads finished it, and the canal closed for good, and the water went still in the great ditch the Irish had dug. But it was not the end of the canal's story, and this part is a small redemption. The abandoned canal, running 184 miles through some of the most beautiful country in the mid-Atlantic, might easily have been paved over and forgotten. In the 1950s, there was a serious plan to turn the whole route into a highway, and a Supreme Court justice named William O. Douglas, who loved the old towpath, challenged the plan by inviting its supporters to walk the entire length of the canal with him, on foot, all 184 miles, to see what would be lost. Enough of them did, and were moved enough by what they saw that the highway was stopped and the canal was eventually protected as a national park. So today, the entire length of it survives. The watered stretches and the locks and the lockhouses and the great stone aqueducts and the Paw Paw Tunnel, that half-mile of darkness lined with 6 million bricks, still stands, and you can walk through it, in the cool and the dark, with the old brick arching over your head, and come out the other side of the mountain the Irish bored through by hand. I have done exactly that, walked into the Paw Paw Tunnel from the daylight, and I recommend it to anyone, because nothing I can say does what those few minutes in the dark do. The tunnel is long enough that when you are in the middle of it, the openings at each end shrink to small, pale coins of light, and around you is only the cool, damp dark and the curve of the old brick close overhead and the water beside the narrow walkway lying black and still. You put your hand on the wall, and you are touching one of those 6 million bricks laid by a man crouched in this same dark by lamplight 180 years ago, with the whole weight of the mountain pressing down where he worked. The sound changes in there. Your footsteps come back at you off the brick, and you become very aware, in a way you cannot be out on the sunny towpath, that you are standing inside a wound cut through solid rock by human hands. That men spent years of their lives in this exact dark, breathing powder smoke, setting these very bricks, some of them dying to do it, so that a boat could pass through a mountain. It is one of the few places on the whole canal where the labor is not abstract, where you are physically inside the thing they suffered to make. When you come out the far end, back into the light and the green of the river valley, you feel it. The difference between the world the diggers worked in and the world their work made possible. And you carry a little of that dark back out into the daylight with you, which is, I think, exactly as it should be. When I walk that towpath, and especially when I walk into that tunnel, I think about all of it at once. The presidents, and the ceremony, and the bad omen of the spade hitting the root. The lawyers at Point of Rocks, burning 4 irreplaceable years. And underneath it all, holding it all up, the Irish. The men who dug it for $8 a month, and their meat and their whiskey. The men who died of cholera and were shoveled into unmarked graves under the very path I am walking on. The men who, in one shameful frozen January, turned their picks and their guns on each other and had to be stopped by the army. And the men who kept digging, year after year, into a mountain to finish a race that was already lost. They built a masterpiece that failed. And I think there is something in that, something truer than the usual story of triumph. Because most human effort is like this, poured with everything we have into things that do not turn out the way we hoped. The canal did not beat the railroad, but the canal is still there, every hand-cut mile of it, and the railroad corridor beside it is just a railroad. The thing the Irish dug by hand, the thing that lost, is the thing people now walk 184 miles to see. I find a strange comfort in that, and I think the men might too, if they could somehow know it. They did not build a highway to the Ohio. They built something that failed at its purpose and was passed by the future almost at once. By the cold logic of the race, their work was wasted. But look what wasted means here. The railroad won, and the railroad's corridor is now just a working rail line, useful and unremarkable, the kind of thing no one crosses a state to walk. The canal lost, and the canal is now a treasure, a long green ribbon of history and beauty that hundreds of thousands of people walk and ride every year precisely because it stopped, because it was left behind, because it became a ruin instead of a highway. The very defeat that broke the hearts of its investors is what preserved it for us. Nobody kept using it hard enough to wear it out or tear it down and build over it. It failed gently into a park. And so the labor of those forgotten Irishmen, which the market judged a loss, turns out to have produced something the market never valued and could not have made on purpose. A place of quiet and memory and grace, one of the loveliest long walks in the country, resting on their bones. I do not think there is a tidy moral in that so much as there is a kind of mercy. The men lost their race and, many of them, their lives. But the thing their hands made outlasted the thing that beat it, and it is beautiful, and people love it, and that is not nothing. It may even be a great deal. And under it, unnamed, are the men who gave their lives to lose that race, and who left behind, without ever meaning to, one of the most beautiful ruins in all of America. and one of its most quietly honest. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.